So I'm going to begin by lighting the chalice and then inviting Miss Mary to read. And then and I'm going to ask if everybody can be so kind as to mute themselves.
Oh, it's the
Other than it,
elder tree.
everybody can yes, mute themselves other than Anita and Bill. And
Video.
Yeah, sure.
still getting some.
And I will see
Where are we? Okay, I think that's everybody muted. Okay, Mary, we'll invite you to do the reading, please.
All right, thanks. I have a very short poem today from the UUA organization. It's short, but I think it applies for today's talk. It's called Come Into This Place, and it was written by Rebecca Edmiston Lang. Come into this place which we make holy by our presence. Come in with all your vulnerabilities and strengths, fears and anxieties, loves and hopes. For here you need not hide, nor pretend, nor be anything other than who you are and are called to be. Come into this place where we can touch and be touched, heal and be healed, forgive and be forgiven. Come into this place where the ordinary is sanctified, the human is celebrated, the compassionate is expected. Come into this place. Together we make it a holy place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was absolutely perfect for today. Our format today is going to be just a little bit different. We decided because there was so much information that could be covered in such a subject to kind of think of some questions for Bill. And so in that, with that in mind, I volunteered to ask the questions as we go along. And the first question for Bill this morning is, what sparked your interest in the history of the church, and how did that lead to you becoming the historian here at UU? Bill?
Bill, you need to unmute, please.
Now I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I should say that as far as being the historian, there's really no job title at church of the historian. It's just, I noticed about 3 or 4 years ago, people started calling me the historian because I do a lot of history work. So, you know, but just to clarify, but how to get interested? This church has such an astonishing history. And I challenge anyone to find a congregation anywhere in the country which has a combination of a more interesting architectural history and a more interesting people history. This church has it all. So it's just, and the more I dig into it, I'm working right now on a group of Quakers who joined the church around the time of Susan B. Anthony did. And it's just interesting. So I hope to get that out in a publication at some point. I mean, on the church website or whatever.
I understand that you have spent some time organizing the history, putting it together, and you actually wrote the description of our church for Wikipedia. How long has it taken you to do that before you felt you were ready to actually talk about it?
I probably started working on that more than 10 years, maybe 12 years ago. And you know, the tricky part is getting to know how to work Wikipedia. And I think I've got that down. If I look back at some of the things I've done on Wikipedia, it adds up. It really has added up. I did do there was a small article on the First Unitarian on Wikipedia when I started, and now it's huge, actually broken into 2 different articles, one on First Unitarian Church, the congregation, and one on First Unitarian, the building. Okay, so it got to be so large, it had to be broken into 2 articles. And so I have continued to work on Wikipedia. The last 2 articles, if anyone's interested, is small articles, is the Reynolds Arcade and Corinthian Hall, which are 2 buildings that were the 2 most important buildings downtown during Susan Anthony's early adulthood. You entered, if you wanted to go hear a lecture by Frederick Douglass at Corinthian Hall, you walked through Reynolds Arcade and past Susan Anthony's father's insurance office. It's that kind of place.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little about moving to our current location and how the congregation at the time felt about moving closer to the suburbs?
Well, they knew they were kind of stuck downtown. They had a building that wasn't really adequate. It was a classic building. Oddly and ironically enough, it was designed by the first president of the American Association of Architects. Good architect, but he was so picky about who he designed for that once a Unitarian church in New England requested that he design a church for them, and he refused because they were Unitarians. He was not going to design a church for Unitarians. He was a Trinitarian. So the Presbyterians got the building downtown. They moved to East Avenue. First Unitarian, their church got bought out by the post office downtown, had to move. So they bought that building, but it got to be inadequate. I've been told that they didn't have a working bathroom in the church itself. You had to go across the street to the parish house. The kitchen was comically inadequate. And they knew that in the works was a possible merger with the Universalist denomination, which of course happened. And the only other congregation of the merged denomination was going to be First Universalist, like a block and a half away. And how was that going to work? So they knew they kind of wanted to get out of downtown, but they didn't want to. They had a rich history of working with doing social kind of work in downtown. So a requirement was is they would move, but they would not move out of Rochester. So where they are now, still within the city limits of Rochester, you have to go another half mile east or half mile south to get to Brighton. And of course, there's a famous story about David Williams, who did not want to leave the building. And he got in the newspapers, he kind of refused to leave at the demolition time. But well, it was a dramatic moment, but yes, he left. And the story is he was actually pleased with the new building when it came. And I should say, why did the actual thing that kicked them into moving, I mean, they kind of wanted to move, but it came to the point where they had to move because of Midtown Plaza being built. So there was a lot of pressure to sell the lot so Midtown Plaza could expand to the size it needed to be. So he signed an agreement with the developers. I think, if my memory's right, I think that was 1959, and they signed an agreement that they could stay in the building until 1961. Well, the developers started developing all around them, digging down lower and lower, and left the church kind of isolated on this little piece of ground. Had to close off the front door because you couldn't get through the front door. You had to go enter through the side door, the rear door, and then the ground started slipping, and they had to abandon the building. It was simply unsafe. So that was a sneaky move on the part of the developer who wanted them to move sooner. So they had to meet. They met at the in the Dryden Theater at the Eastman House for a couple of years. So it's actually probably worse for them than the pandemic. That they to move this very temporary headquarters, and I'm not sure what they did for offices, but anyway.
How do we choose? You finished? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How do we choose Kahn instead of Frank Lloyd Wright or other prominent architects at the time?
Well, they certainly considered Frank Lloyd Wright, and they actually got in touch with him. But if my memory is right, I think he was 91 years old, and he was still cranking out buildings, but he didn't sound too interested. And then, as a matter of fact, just literally a month or two after they got in touch with him, he died. So that would have been nice. He had designed already two famous Unitarian churches, the one in Unity Temple and I can't say the name of the western suburb of Chicago, and the one in Madison, Wisconsin. So that would have been nice. But so they also got in touch with some other famous architects, but it became clear that they were talking to big architectural offices run by a famous architect. And it became clear that the design for the church was going to be passed off to some subcommittee, some group of architects, overseen by the famous architect. I think Saarinen was one. And they didn't want that. They wanted, so they made a trip to Philadelphia to meet with Louis Kahn, who was an up-and-coming architect. And the story is they parked, and he had a small office. He had a very small office, and he was clearly in charge of everything. And it wasn't broken into different units. You could yell across his office to everyone, "Hey, Sam, have you got that drawing done yet?" It was that kind of office. It was not huge. So they parked where they thought the office was, and Jean France said, "Wait a minute, that's him walking down the street." So I rolled down the window. I said, "You Louis Kahn?" He said, "Yes." He said, "We're from the First Unitarian. We have an appointment with you." He said, "Great. Do you have an apple?" And Jean France, "Well, yes, I do." She always carried a spare apple. So he said, well, he was hungry, so she handed him an apple. They went upstairs and talked, and they loved Kahn, and he was happy with them, and it just went from there.
Great story. How involved was the congregation in the developing the concept of the church?
Louis Kahn didn't know what he's getting into when you design for Unitarians. They got very involved. Someone built a scale model of his proposal and did sound studies and light studies of how it's going to work, and actually made suggestions. And in some cases, Kahn adopted them. One of his early designs called for indirect light coming from the rooftop, but with like concrete boxes. Everything's got to be concrete with Kahn. With concrete boxes up there with slits in them, so you get indirect light. And so some engineer in the congregation did some calculations. Said, "Do you realize those things are going to weigh 33 tons each? You want several of them on the roof?" So that one went out. Kahn came up with his first design. It was a 3-story thing. And the estimated cost was 3 times what they had told him they could afford. And they threw that one out right now. I just, forget it. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the head of the church committee, communicating with Kahn, quit. She was disgusted. So they said, "You have to start totally over." And they were afraid he'd walk away at that point and say, "Look, you pay me for my work done." But no, he came back and said, "Okay, he'll do a second design." And he did. He came back with the second design. And he worked through several iterations of that. One of the final iterations, one of the things that got cut was in the Susan B. Anthony room, where the fireplace is now. There was going to be a little tiny Inglenook, I think it's called, like a little tiny room off the Susan B. Anthony room that would be maybe room for 6 or 8 people to sit in. in a kind of U-shaped thing. And that got cut at the last minute. So they kept making design changes up to the end. And I should say, one of the things that they told Kahn in writing is, do not design the church to be expanded. We are not going to expand it. If our congregation grows, we're going to create satellite congregations. So what happened? The church grew so fast after they moved in that in less than 2 years, they got in touch with Kahn and said, we got to have an expansion. you got to build an extension to this building. And he said, no, you told me not to do that. You told me not to design that. So I'm not going to do it. The church is designed to be an architectural piece in itself. It should not be extended. So he said, well, okay, we'll get someone else to do it. So naturally, Kahn said, well, okay, I'll do it. So we got Kahn to do the extension too.
All that information are things that I haven't really heard before, so I find it really fascinating. How did the congregation respond? No, I'm sorry, you're going to tell us about the design of the building. Some elements of the building people question.
Okay, that's a big question. We know that most of the specs that the church handed to Kahn were technical, like how many classrooms, how big the kitchen, that sort of thing. But they did include one kind of philosophical, if that's not quite the word, specification. They said, we want the church to reflect, I think this is an exact quote, reflect the dignity of humankind, not the depravity. Okay. And Kahn responded to that. And after he built it, he said, I did not design this building like the great cathedrals of the past to express God's grandeur and humanity's puniness. He said, he was responding again to the concept of human dignity. And we know that Kahn's approach was always, well, especially in this case, he said he wanted to design a building that would uniquely express the needs and desires of Unitarians specifically, not just churches in general, but specifically Unitarians. And I think there's, I think you can kind of see that it would not be suitable for a typical church. I made some notes. I'm trying to yes. His phrase he liked to use was, when he designs something like that, he likes to consult volume 0, a book that hasn't been written yet. So that's what he did with designing First Unitarian. And I think you'll have to admit it's unusual. When after it was built, it was during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, the State Department organized a tour, a cultural tour of the Soviet Union. And one of the items was a scale model of First Unitarian. And so in Leningrad, Kahn was there and was speaking with the mayor of Leningrad. And the mayor said, that doesn't look like a church. And Kahn said, well, maybe that's why it was chosen for exhibition in the Soviet Union, because they were, officially atheists. So, okay. Right. So design the building. Again, talking in most general terms, Kahn said, especially for this church, he said he wanted to express what he called, in metaphorical terms, to express silence and light. And reading Kahn is a little tricky because you never quite know, like you read it and you say, no, what did he just say? Okay. So silence, his biographers seem to agree that to Kahn, silence meant the urge, not simply the absence of sound, but the urge to be, the urge to create, which in Kahn's philosophy, the desire to be is the desire to create is the essence of life. So that was one half of what he was doing, was silence. The other half was light, which to Kant was what is. So if silence is the urge to be, and light is a metaphorical term for what is. And that was the atmosphere he was trying to create. And I have the exact quote, if I can find it here. Right. He said it was creating a place where, quote, the desire to be, to express, crosses with the possible. So that's the atmosphere he was creating in the church. So architectural historians and his biographers, there have been several biographies, have pointed out that as opposed to maybe a Frank Lloyd Wright church, which one major theme would be comfort, that for Kant, a major theme is challenge. So what we have here is challenge, an atmosphere of challenge, not comfort, which goes with the idea of a desire to be, crosses with the possible, because that is a challenge. And another major thing here, and in all of Kant's work, is authenticity. If you ever notice that there's no surface in the entire church that's hidden by paint, which actually people have pointed out that's not 100% true. The bathroom stalls, okay, are hidden by paint, but that's not a major architectural feature, right? Nothing else, no other surface is hidden by paint. So that's part of the authenticity. What you see is what you get. And anyone walking into the church would just presume that it's supported by a hidden steel frame. It isn't. What you see is what you get there. That church supports itself, it's concrete. Within those concrete columns, there are steel rods. It's what reinforced concrete is. It's steel rods embedded within concrete to help damp down this kind of movement. So that is a concrete block and poured concrete building. There's no hidden steel frame. So it's a very honest building. That's the authenticity part. And he never said this, but I wonder, I mean, to me, that creates a good example for the congregation. Is be your true self. So that building, that's what the building is. So I'll quit there.
Can you say a little on the cross in the sanctuary, or is it a cross or not in our ceiling?
It's a cruciform structure. So it's not a Christian cross. And Kant liked that shape. And Kant, who of course was Jewish, first used that design in the Jewish Native Center in Trenton, New Jersey. That was before First Unitarian was built. So that's a pretty good hint that he did not intend it to be a Christian symbol.
Thanks. What about the congregation? How did they respond once they actually moved into the new building?
Quite well. As I said earlier, the congregation grew so rapidly. They were actually renting rooms from the Harley School. And that was within, again, in less than 2 years. And there were, car ferrying people back and forth. So it grew explosively. So I presume from that it was happy. And I'll go on a bit of a tangent there. If what Kant was designing a building for was to help people, again, crossing what could be with the possible, and to kind of, it's a stimulating atmosphere. It's not an atmosphere that you go into and it's maybe a lot of churches you're supposed to feel diminished. Maybe you're supposed to feel like subdued and maybe submit to God's will. The atmosphere at First Unitarian is lively. And if you ask people to do like a guided meditation exercise and say, close your eyes and where in this building does the energy come from? In traditional churches, it would be from down front, right? First Unitarian, if you did that, you might think, well, the energy comes from the congregation. The building kind of does that. And so if Kahn was designing a building specifically, uniquely for Unitarians, then that's exactly what he was hoping for, because that's, Unitarians are kind of like that. And it's an interesting question of how do they respond short term, which I discussed earlier, but long term, how did that work out for the congregation? Well, it grew, as I said. When we moved into the building, we were a congregation in a mid-sized city with a typical size for a congregation that was typical for a mid-sized city. And we grew into a congregation that's much larger than that of the average mid-sized city. We're not the only one in the country in that situation. Oddly enough, Madison, Wisconsin is another one, a mid-sized city with a large congregation. Oddly enough, they have a building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So architects might have something to do with this. But there's more to it than just the size of the congregation. It's like, what has the congregation done? And if you look at what the congregations, things that have been produced or developed from within the congregation since we moved into the buildings, there's several things that have benefited the congregation, benefited the denomination as a whole. For example, you get Dick Gilbert's Building Your Own Theology, which probably several of us in this conversation participated in. That was the main adult curriculum for several years within the denomination across the country. Well, but you can't say the building did that. Dick Gilbert did that. He's really good at that sort of thing. But there were other things. Wellspring, which is a spiritual development. I'm trying to say her name, who's going to be preaching at her church.
Jen Crow.
Thank you, Jen Crow. So she developed it. She and several other people developed it, and that's in use across the denomination. And then you had, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's an organization called the UU Musicians Network, which is it's large, and it had a lot to do with developing the songbooks, the hymn books we now use. And that was started by Joyce Gilbert and Ed Shell at First Unitarian. They initiated that thing. And then you have, of course, Connect and Breathe, which is I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. Yes, I see Laura saying, yeah, exactly. Laura is works with that, which is a talk line, a non-judgmental talk line for people who had abortion, no matter recently or years back. And that serves at least the eastern half of the country or wherever. So we have these things that you can't say, well, okay, the building did that. Louis Kahn didn't do that. But these things that have kind of benefited the entire denomination that have come from this congregation in this mid-sized city, it's kind of unusual that a congregation in a city that size has grown to be as large as it has and has produced so many things that have been used across the denomination. And you can't put your finger on it and say, well, Louis Kahn's building did this. No, that would be absurd. But you really have to think, there's a lot of coincidences here. Just when he claimed he was designing a building to do this sort of thing, son of a gun, that's what happened. So, okay.
Thank you. Ruth wanted to know what was the addition to the building, and it's as you walk in the door, it's that whole section to your left beyond the arches that was added, where all the offices, the gallery, the ministerial studies, and upstairs, where the Atkinson School was, that whole section was added. So absolutely fascinating information. If you could,
I'll jump in right there and say, before they built the addition, there's a question of where were the offices?
Yeah.
Okay, they were in the rooms nearest the ground floor women's restroom, facing Winton Road, and they were the, if you would leave the women's restroom and walk clockwise around the sanctuary, it would be the first 3 rooms on your left. So that was the original offices.
thank you. If you could ask Con a question or two about the building, are there something that you would like to ask him after studying all about it, Bill?
Well, one that jumps in my mind is, would be, how was it like working with the congregation at First Unitarian? Was it irritating or was it energizing? And I kind of, from what I've read of Con, I think he would say it was energizing. I think he liked the process of bouncing ideas back and forth. He certainly did it with a lot of the people in his office. He had some really good people in his office, and I think he liked that process. That would be mine.
Okay. Thanks. I would ask him why he designed a building with a flat roof, which has given us a lot of trouble over the years.
Well, I'll toss in there is it's not merely the fact that it's flat. There's something else that's causing a problem. I hike a lot at Cobb's Hill, and if you go up on Cobb's Washington Grove, if you go up there and look down on the city, you see a bunch of flat roofs, and you know, on the schools, and that's not even counting like Lowe's and Home Depot and the malls. There are a bunch of flat roofs in this town, and they can be made to work. So I don't know the details of why we've had quite so much trouble, but it's not merely the fact it's flat.
Something else. Okay. Interesting. Who, and you've talked about one, the design of the building, and I'm really fascinated by that. Do you think influenced the growth of our congregation to one of the largest in the denomination?
Well, of course, Dick Gilbert's going to get a lot of credit for that, because he was here for so long in the period just after we moved into the building. The minister just before him, West, was that his name?
Bob West.
Bob West, yeah, was excellent. I think he went on to be head of the UUA.
Yes.
And then we had, during the really good period, when we had Scott and Karen, and the congregation grew again explosively. It seems to have bounced right back down again. But so we had that, but it was a strong congregation before that. It wasn't, it was strong. David Reese Williams in the 20s and 30s and 40s was a good minister. And then it got off to a good start way back, well, in the Susan B. Anthony days. We had William Henry Channing came in, and Susan B. Anthony expressly said that he was the reason her Quaker family joined the church. And other people have said the same. He was, I think he had a philosophy of life that kind of that worked, that resonated with the progressive Quakers, the radical Quakers, some would call them. And there were a bunch there was a group of Quakers that came in then and stayed with the church for decades. And people like Mary Hallowell played an important role in the boys' evening home. And that was in the 1890s. And she was an important force in that. And that was when it was still downtown. And the area around what is now the Strong Museum of Play was kind of a apartment area and fairly low income. And it was heavily populated with Jewish immigrants from Poland and Russia. So they started the boys' evening home for the neighborhood kids. And there was also a girls' evening home, but it didn't quite make quite as much of a splash. And the boys' evening home, people like Mary Hollowell played a big role in making that work. She was called Aunt Mary, I think, by the kids. And some volunteers from Brit Kodesh helped out. And so I think of the kids who went through, it wasn't exclusively Jewish, but it was, I think, predominantly so. I think, as I recall right, 2 of the boys who went through that school became rabbis, and one became an executive secretary of maybe Brit Kodesh, and another became a member of Congress. So the school was very important, and the Quakers that William Henry Channing helped to bring in played a big role there.
Thanks. I understand that you have 1 or 2 amusing stories that you've run across as you've done all this history, and I was wondering if you would be willing to share them with us.
Sure. Well, you know, in the Susan B. I'm sorry, in the Williams Gallery, if you look east through those big windows to the big yard outside, it's called a jack arch. It's a very shallow arch over those 2 windows. You have to look close to see it's actually, there's an arch shape there. It's very shallow. It kind of goes like this. And I'm told it would be hard to, it'd be hard to duplicate it because the arch is 3 bricks deep. It's a fan of bricks. Each brick had to be cut 3 different ways, and every time you moved 1 more step on the fan across like this, had to be cut 3 different ways. So they had to work and work and work to develop this wide arch, and there are 2 of them in that room, and there are quite a few, maybe like a couple dozen in the addition. So the story is, when the building inspector came in and he saw those arches, he said, "I can't approve those things." He said, "What holds them up?" And the master mason who built them said, "They're arches." Arches hold themselves up. So he ended up approving it. And look at them, you know, they're in perfect shape. So Condon knew what he was doing. But there's one thing, if you're not, no matter how great an architect you are, there's some things you're going to overlook. So if you stand in front of the building and you walk to one side or the other of the front door, you look up, there are these, you know, the brick, like semi-enclosures, kind of hoods over the windows. If you look up at the top, there are metal grills. Those grills do not come from Kahn. That was added on a rush basis afterwards when kids discovered that you could go into those brick places, and you know, the brick places are about this far apart. You could put your feet on one wall and your shoulders on this wall and start unching and end up on the roof. And they did. And someone came in on a Saturday and said, "What are kids doing on the roof?" So I quickly installed the grills.
Great. Great stories. Okay, we are going to open up the discussion for some questions, recognizing that Bill might not have all the answers because it's such an extensive subject, but that's perfectly all right. And I was so concerned about bringing my questions that I forgot to bring a clock with me. So we have a commitment to finish up in, by 11. And so if somebody would kind of let me know when 11 is, that would be really helpful. To begin with, Ann Perry said that she had a couple stories that she would like to add or fill in. And so why don't we begin there, and then we'll see what other people's questions are. Ann.
Hi, thank you. When you were talking about the interim period between the old building and the new building, that was the period when my dad was the minister, Bill Jenkins. And we had the services in the Dryden Theater, as you said, but we had religious education and 1 or 2 offices in Hutchison House. The other location was the minister's residence, which was owned by the church, which is where I lived. And that was at 1895 Highland Avenue. And many meetings were held in our house during that time. And that was a contentious time in the church of leaving a treasured old building and all the issues that were coming up. And in the UUA, they described that period at our church as the unintended interim. And it led to the UUA making it very clear that especially when a longtime minister leaves, you need a period of time with an interim who is trained to really move the church into the new period. Another thing that I found amusing was I met an architect named Duncan Buell later in life when my sister lived in the building he owned. And Duncan was a young architect, applied for a job with the Louis Kahn firm, got hired, was ready to go to Philadelphia. And Louis Kahn sent him back to Rochester to supervise the building. So he was kind of not happy about that, but it's the same Buell family as Buell Road. So that's who that is. Another thing is during the period when Louis Kahn was doing the design, he had many conversations with my dad about Unitarianism. And that whole thing of authenticity was one of my dad's really fundamental beliefs around Unitarianism. So I just want to add those couple of things.
Thank you. I see Nancy and Glenn Cook. You have to unmute yourself first.
Yes, thank you. Bill, a few questions on the cost of the church. One, how much was the whole cost? Two, I can imagine it must have been daunting to take that on by the congregation, knowing sometimes how difficult it is to raise money, especially to build a big church like that. And thirdly, I know in Louis Kahn's design, he had designed in the capability to have a pipe organ, but I know we couldn't afford it at the time. Was there anything else that was passed over because of cost constraints? And how did they finance the purchase of the church? Several questions, Bill, sorry.
A lot of questions.
Okay, help me keep track of them. Let's see. So maybe to start backwards, they financed it by selling their downtown building. And by actually got some extra money by agreeing to move out early, which they didn't really have a choice. So that covered a huge part of the cost. And I'm afraid to, no, I won't be able to say that the cost off the top of my head. I have to look it up. But I will point out that one thing they discovered is that hiring Louis Kahn was not going to be that much more expensive than hiring like a good local architect. So that was not an extra cost.
There was a mortgage.
There was, yep.
Okay.
But the downtown building, I guess I should say, was a really good down payment. And so things they might have, so early things they could not do from day one when the building opened. I think I've been told that the kitchen, for example, wasn't furnished yet because they just didn't have the money. I mean, they were desperate to move in. They wanted their own headquarters, own building. So they moved in before everything was fully done. So they didn't have an organ. The organ came quite a bit later. Kitchen came a bit later.
There was a mortgage from a downtown bank.
Okay. Howie,
I
next.
unmuted, so I don't know.
Are you done, Bill? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Okay. Howie Kirschenbaum. Next question. Unmute yourself, please.
I think you mentioned that this move took place about the same time that the Unitarians and the Universalists were merging. And I wonder if any thought was given to actually merging the congregations in Rochester, maybe moving into the Universalist building together, or so yeah, I guess that's basically my question. And I wondered whether any of the growth of the congregation that happened along with the move might have been from Universalists increasing the numbers of Unitarians, or if those are two totally separate processes.
Well, there was already a degree of cooperation. They had I believe I'm correct in saying they had a joint church school in the last few years of both being downtown. And there was some discussion between the two congregations of should they simply merge, and it didn't go anywhere. And my understanding partly that was, well, how do you handle a situation where you had two ministers and now you're going to have one? Okay, how's that going to work? Who's going to leave? So you had questions like that. So it was discussed, but it didn't really go anywhere.
Okay. I see Richard and Vicky Swartz with their hand up. And unmute. Yep, got it.
I think Dave Friedman was ahead of us, but I'll ask the question anyway.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed him.
First of all, Bill, thank you. And if you're the one who put the slideshow together about the construction of the church, I would recommend that to anybody who hasn't already looked at it. It's very thorough and very informative, and we enjoyed going through it. So thank you for doing that. My question has to do with the purchase of the land. How did it happen that was where the church was located? It was just available and they bought it?
Well, it was one, I don't know the full story, but it was one of the very few places inside the city of Rochester with enough space to build the kind of building that they wanted, what they wanted. I believe it was originally built for housing for the, can't say the name of the big gear machine building on University Avenue as you head toward downtown. Gleason, yes. I think the Gleasons had the land with the idea of maybe building housing for their employees there. So it was available and not much else was available. And the location was good because, you know, it's so close to the expressway. So I think they just basically didn't have a lot of choice.
Jack said a little bit about that 2 weeks ago when we were talking about the organ. Would you just like to add anything to that you know?
Okay. Well,
and then we'll come to David. Sorry, David.
well, that goes back to the question of they couldn't afford an organ at first. Even though Kahn did leave a space within the walls for the air to blow from the basement, the blower is in the basement directly below. As you walk through the front doors into the sanctuary, the blower is directly one floor below your feet. So he left a space in the walls for the blower air to reach the organ, which hadn't been built yet. But again, you can't plan for everything. Once you buy the organ and you have this big organ console and you want to put it on the choir loft, how do you get it up there? You can't take it up the stairs. You have to bring a kind of a lift truck in. Well, there's only so much room to bring a lift truck into those front doors, the sanctuary doors. And the lift trucks you could bring through those doors would not go over the railings to the choir loft. So if you go up to the railings now, close to where the organ console is, you'll notice kind of a plate about this big on top. It's bolted to the railings. That's where they hacksawed the railings apart so you could lift the console up, set it down, then they put the railings back and did a very, very good job. They bolted a plate to the top of that to hold everything in place. So you basically don't notice it. I think they did a wonderful job.
David's coming.
Yeah.
She wants you.
Okay. David?
Yeah, so I remember there was some discussion of controversy about the climate appropriateness of the selection of bricks used on the building. Do you have any knowledge to elaborate on that topic?
So we have to have them sealed everywhere.
Well, apparently, everything I know about this, it's kind of hearsay, and you might know actually more about it than I do, but one big problem with the bricks is they end up getting salt spray over the years and the decades from Winton Road, and it was creating an unsightly mess. This had been maybe 20 years ago or such. Dave Schwartz would know more about this. And there was some kind of treatment put on the bricks to kind of clean up the mess. And I think there was a feeling that if you'd chosen a different kind of bricks, and that Louis Kahn should have been on top of that. If you'd chosen a different kind of bricks, you wouldn't have had that problem.
Yeah, I'd heard that it was a softer brick. It was a brick more appropriately used in Washington and Philadelphia, and not so much in the northern climes. But I don't know that as a fact. That's all.
They had another problem. They had another problem with the bricks on the elevator shaft addition, which you can see from the patio off the Susan B. Anthony room. When it came time to build the elevator shaft there, about 20 years ago or something, they had to search for bricks that would kind of match. And they found a set of bricks that would match, except these bricks had every now and then were interspersed with maybe 1 out of 20 bricks would be a very dark color. It's okay, we'll use bricklayers don't use the dark color bricks. And somehow the information did not get down to bricklayers, and they used the dark color bricks. So if you stand on the patio and look at the elevator shaft, you see like 1 out of every 20 bricks is going to be too dark. Okay, we can live with that.
Jack and Sandy?
Are we muted? Wait, we're
Looks like it.
gonna
We
unmute.
can hear you.
I wondered if Louis Kahn saw the hangings that were in the church.
He designed them. He designed those hangings. Yeah.
So he did see them hanging.
Yep. That was the hangings represent the full color spectrum. And of course, Louis Kahn was very interested in light. Okay. So he designed them. And if you examine them closely, the yarns only have 3 colors. It's the primary colors of red, blue, and yellow. I can't even say it. But and then there's a question of, and he got a famous Jack and Nora Larson to weave them. And there was a question of, can you do what he wanted done, create the full color spectrum with only 3 colors of yarn? And he had to do some convincing, but he convinced them, and it's done. So that's fully Kahn. And I should say, and Khan called for a really, really large tapestry to be on the wall you face during a service. And that was going to be the most expensive tapestry, and it just never quite happened. So,
John Steepy has his hand up,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Under the sanctuary, I'm not aware that there's a basement under there. Is that correct?
correct. Directly, so the sanctuary floor itself sits on dirt, or probably gravel and then dirt.
That's good. Because bringing in a forklift, those things are really heavy on a per square inch basis. And if Louis Kahn didn't divide, had a basement, but not, I think the forklift would have wound up in the basement.
But the corridor around the sanctuary, that you can walk beneath that. So there's a utility corridor beneath that.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Jack and Sandy, do you have more to say? Or you're just waving at me?
Two architectural questions for Bill about Khan. How typical was the clear story? Did he use that frequently? So clear story one. Question two, I sort of remember something about that big cross in the ceiling of the sanctuary being uniquely long. And there was some issue of whether you could make something that size that would support that weight. Was that a unique structure to Khan?
But no, it was not. There's a similar structure in Khan's library at the Philip Exeter Academy. Somewhat similar. And they're kind of like clear story windows are like very high windows that you basically can't see out of. They're just bringing light from way, way, way up there. And the Phillips Exeter Academy Library has that. And Khan's crowning achievement was the Parliament building for Bangladesh. I mean, he created the Parliament building and the entire government complex. And it clear story, yeah, I guess you could call it that. It's not a cross design, but it's similar, light coming from way up above. So people are two different of his biographers have pointed out that Khan seemed to hit his stride for the first time at First Unitarian. And after that, I think every single thing he did was a big budget item, which I think every single piece was considered to be a masterpiece. And again, culminating with the Parliament building for Bangladesh.
Let's see, one more person had their hand up. It was David, I think. David Friedman, did he leave?
No, it's Glenn and Nancy, and we are at 11. So
we are at 11.
It's a real quick question. We can probably fit it, but we're just a minute after 11.
Yeah, it's very quick. Many years ago, we went on trips with Joyce Gilbert, various places in the world, and we were on a trip in Paris, France. And at the same time, coincidentally, there was a Khan exhibit on display in Paris. So we naturally went in and were looking at his various presentations, and there's a video of our church. And lo and behold, there was Don Wilder walking into church one Sunday morning, and here we were in Paris, France, seeing Don walk in, among others, of course.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Bill. This has been, at least I found this absolutely fascinating. And I think when you leave with more questions, sometimes that's a good thing.
Great. Well, I'm so happy to be invited.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. It was lovely.
Yep. Next week, are you going to tell us? Next week is John Steepy.
Okay, we look forward to that. I'm going to blow out the chalice. wish you all a wonderful week, and we will see you next week. And thank you again, Bill, for a wonderful, informative conversation.
Yep.